This is the first time that I have hosted the Wild Science webinar from here in the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission headquarters, and just making sure everything was working okay. Welcome, everybody. We were going to be hearing today from Sean Lusk and Jessica Feltz, and we're going to hear a presentation. There we go. Jessica's going to be talking about an introduction to the application of conservation social science in Arkansas, and Sean will be talking about the Lake Ouachita Florida bass stocking and how that has affected growth of largemouth bass in Lake Ouachita. I believe Jessica's going to be going first. Once again, I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded, and if you can keep your microphones on mute until we open it up for questions. Each presenter will have about 15 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes or so of question and answer. You can always type questions or comments in the comment bar as well. So without any further ado, we'll get things started. I think Jessica is going to kick things off for us today. Jessica Feltz is a conservation social scientist in the fisheries division here at Game and Fish. Been here a little over 3 years. Prior to working at Game and Fish, she was with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, where she worked and promoted angler citizen science programs, as well as assisting the state's Human Dimensions Coordinator. Jessica got her undergraduate degree at Mississippi State University in fish, wildlife, and fisheries management, and then a master's degree in natural resource management at Auburn University, where she completed a Human Dimensions research project understanding angler use and specialization at Alabama's State Lakes. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me just present my screen. Can everybody see that?
We got it, Jessica. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Trey, for that introduction. Like you said, my name's Jessica. I'm a conservation social scientist. My working title here at AGFC is Human Dimensions Specialist, and I'm just going to give a kind of a really high-level introduction to conservation social science, and then also talk about kind of how we've incorporated that into AGFC in the recent years. So historically, just on a high level, when we think about natural resource management, we're really kind of what the public perceives of us and kind of what we think we're tasked with as a game and fish conservation agency is the management and the conservation of species, whether it be an individual or a population level. And then as managers, we know that we can't really talk about species management without talking about habitat management. But in the bigger sense, natural resource management is really a three-legged stool, so to speak. And it's in conservation, we have to know all there is to know to make proper decisions regarding a species or a population. And like I mentioned, that goes hand in hand with the habitat. But we also have to have a good understanding of this people side, and that's the people that interact directly with the species or the habitat. And it's not always people that directly interact with these. It's, when historically we think of hunters and anglers, but it's everybody else. It's landowners, private landowners, it's industry people, and it's even the people in our agency, the stakeholders that we don't commonly think of, that need to be better understood to make sound conservation decisions. So natural resource management is this this connection and this understanding of the species, the habitat, but then also how people interact with the species, and then ultimately how people interact with the habitat. And so to understand the people side of it, there's this broad umbrella term known as conservation social science. It's a multidisciplinary field that applies various social science techniques to examine research questions that have implications for fish and wildlife conservation efforts. And social science really, and basically what all that means is social science is an umbrella term that pulls techniques and methods of inquiry from multiple areas, anywhere from psychology, sociology, economics, even marketing, political sciences, and you can see a lot of them there. And I'll just use myself as an example. Not one conservation social scientist is an expert in all of these. It would be very difficult. And so for myself, what my training has and kind of how I use my skill set is primarily focused in communication, natural resource communication, and then traditional sociology. And then I have experience in recreation and in psychology a little bit. And so all of those come together to start to answer questions about people and how they impact fish and wildlife conservation efforts. By using all those various disciplines, conservation social science can help answer really applied questions that impact the management our biologists and technical staff do on a day-to-day basis, such as who is our target audience, what are their attitudes, values, and opinions, how can we motivate or change behavior if it's possible, how does culture influence people's relationship with natural resources? And this is a big one because I think it kind of gets forgotten that culturally, when we talk about changes in our society and our culture and how those might change over time, how those adapt, I mean, we're kind of in the midst of a huge one socially right now. How does that outside world kind of impact natural resources? And it's kind of the job of a social scientist to kind of help make that connection. And then lastly, how effective are our conservation strategies? Are we staying relevant? Are we making decisions that benefit the users on top of also benefiting and conserving a species or a habitat? And so that's why conservation social science is really important. But at the core of it, the use of conservation social science and the need to use it it is built into AGFC's mission statement. And this mission statement was drafted many years before we even had conservation social scientists on staff. And the mission to conserve and enhance Arkansas's fish and wildlife in their habitats while promoting sustainable use, public understanding, and support. And through conservation social science, that's where you really start to understand promoting sustainable use. Public understanding goes without saying, and then also garnering support. And all of this goes to say that if you don't get to know the people part of fish and wildlife management, you don't really know that the decisions you're making as technical experts are in line with how people are using the resource. And that goes to, do we understand, are they using the resource in a sustainable way? Do they understand the decisions we're making and how that might impact them? And then ultimately, are the decisions we making allowing people to not only support the agency, but continue to support the agency? The decisions we make allow and encourage future generations to support our agency and the decisions that we make. And again, that's all built into the mission statement. And I'll kind of talk about how we started to embrace conservation social science at AGFC by using a few examples. And so I was hired in 2018. There is another staff conservation social scientist that's housed in our research division. That position also began in 2018. And so really the formal use of social science kind of in the agency internally, because we have that capacity, is only a few years old. But social science has been used previously. A lot of it's been contracted work. But since I've been here, we've been able to use conservation social science to understand public desires and opinions. And we've done that by various surveys. And I say stakeholder surveys because I really want to talk about this term stakeholders. You might be thinking stakeholders I'm really talking about hunters and anglers, maybe private landowners, industry people, but stakeholders are any person that is directly or indirectly impacted by the decisions we make, so conservation decision making. And so by definition, everybody on this call, everybody in this agency is a stakeholder to conservation decision making. And so we've done internal surveys to better understand staff's, regulation complexity and redundancy. We've asked staff to kind of give us input about like their perceptions and their understanding of our regulations and where those might need to be improved. We've done a GIS user survey to help inform one of our complementary divisions, our GIS division. Do people understand what they do? Do people understand how they can be used? And is there anything that the GIS division staff can do to improve their experience? And we've even done a CWD seminar employee survey to better understand people's perception of a very complex topic. So you all may remember that the research division held a CWD seminar that went over just kind of the agency stance of what CWD is, where we're at with it in the state, and to kind of help share some common messages so that if staff in the field were approached about this, they could better, have a consistent message and understanding from an agency side. And we did a survey to understand, was that message received? Was the information clear? Do you feel confident sharing this information with the public? And how can the messaging be improved from an internal standpoint? And all of those are really, really important so that what we do internally is translated externally to external stakeholders, which is really honestly where I spend a lot of my time personally in my work. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but in my time here, we've had projects done that have evaluated hunters as it relates to CWD, WMA turkey hunters, commercial anglers, stream team participants, dove hunters. We've even done evaluative data collection in the form of feedback from people that have attended public fishing events. We've used our license database to contact resident and non-resident anglers to get a better sense of their, attitudes, values, and opinions. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but all of these groups are really important to understand because the decisions we make all impact these groups. Conservation social science is also important because it helps provide a baseline of people's understanding regarding a specific issue. A really good example of where we've kind of used that is the trout permit increase focus groups. And I started with surveys because a lot of the work that I'm asked to do and participate in is so focused in, we need to do a survey or we should do a survey. And surveys are really great. But sometimes we have such specific issues that need a little more involved. And so we can change our methodology of how we communicate to resolve these issues. And so for this project, we used focus groups and we wanted to determine the level of support for a proposed fee increase and then also gather input about how stakeholders felt those fees needed to be allocated if the proposed fee were enacted. And to do this, we did facilitated focus groups across the state, and participants were recruited using a snowball sampling methodology, which is basically we started with a top contact, and we asked that person to put us in contact with another person who could put us in contact with another person so that we got a group of well-represented stakeholders that would be impacted by this decision. And a few of the just high-level results. One, we were able to determine there was general broad support for a fee increase to the trout permit, but all of that was dependent upon transparency and communication for the use of those funds. Basically, the public was saying, hey, we support and we see the need for this fee increase, but we want to know, as directly impacted stakeholders, how the funds are being spent and who is benefiting from them. And that's a fair ask, in my opinion. We also were able to understand some trout fishery and access prioritized needs from stakeholders. We found out that there was people's perception of quality access was a little different than kind of maybe what internally we thought, and there was a need for some improvements there. And it's, better boat and walk-in access, a huge ask was more signage at access points, just detailing regulations to hopefully increase compliance. And oddly enough, people were really adamant they wanted more restrooms at access points. And then finally, when our staff went to go propose this fee increase to the legislator, we were able to have public support in line with that ask. And so we'd go to legislators, we'd ask them for this fee increase. And naturally, their question, with how it always goes, is, well, how does that impact my constituency? How are my voters going to feel about that? And we were able to say, well, actually, your voters support it, and here's why. And so it was a very successful project. And as you probably all know, the trout permit was successfully increased, I believe, in 2019. Conservation social science also helps us to identify where public resistance may occur. Just a textbook example of this is the turkey regulation focus groups. Another time where focus groups was really the best way to get at solving this issue. But the turkey program coordinator, Jeremy Wood, and the staff conservation social scientists in the research division wanted to assess public attitudes towards potential turkey hunting regulation changes. So they facilitated focus groups across the state, and they recruited these participants from hunters that responded to the 2019 Spring Gobbler Survey. Through this process, staff were able to collect tailored feedback from a dedicated representative group of turkey hunters. And what that means is they were able to speak to turkey hunters from every part of the state, north, south, public land, private land, you know, really dedicated specialized turkey hunters to maybe your more generalist turkey hunter. And the benefit of going this route was if they had just done a broad survey, using the license database, the likelihood that they would have received a high number of known current turkey hunters would have probably been a lot less than the people that participated in these facilitated focus groups. And so through this process, staff were able to communicate historical and current turkey management information that helped inform these regulation proposals, which is really critical as we start to make conservation decisions. We do that, and we know internally as specialists that we do these with the best interest of the species or the habitat, but also with people in mind. But externally, not everybody really kind of has that perception that we are making those decisions. And so when we get a chance and our staff gets a chance to go face to face to really explain the why behind our decision making, you start to build trust, you increase transparency, and by that, you hopefully are starting to increase buy-in and support. And then if it's a regulation change, you obviously want to enhance compliance. And so after talking with Jeremy about this project, he shared with me that during the public comment period, which, as you all know, regulation processes require a 30-day, when you propose a new regulation, it has to do a mandatory 30-day public comment period. And during that time, the comments they received were largely supportive of these proposed regulation changes, which is a little bit different than maybe historically how things have been done. And I think that, again, is really critical in the long run because we were able to increase trust and transparency and really public understanding of the decisions that need to be made. We're also able to use conservation social science to track trends in public opinions over time. A good example of this is the WMA Waterfowl Hunter Use Survey. And the goal of this survey was to assess hunter satisfaction and perceived crowding to inform WMA waterfowl hunting management. And the surveys weren't all done in the same manner. They've changed methodologies slightly, but basically intercept surveys were conducted using a randomly designed process where they took, every WMA has multiple access points, but they randomly selected access, time, and day of the week, similar to a Creel survey. And they did intercept surveys, which is also what a Creel survey is, between 2016 and 2020. And I believe these are still ongoing. But what the results showed was that hunter satisfaction remained pretty consistent between hunting seasons over years. The number of ducks seen and the number of ducks shot were important factors for predicting satisfaction. And then finally, that hunters on average indicated that crowding really had no strong negative effect on their experience. I believe it was over 90% of respondents also indicated that they were going to continue to duck hunt and possibly duck hunt more in future years. And so doing this intercept survey, we were able to determine that there is some there is some feelings of crowdedness, but not enough to actually impact participation or use or visitation to these WMAs, which is really important as we make management decisions and regulation decisions, such as hunting dates for resident and non-residents on these WMAs. And finally, conservation social science is really important to be able to facilitate communication between the public and our staff. And a really good example of this are these fisheries management plan input meetings. And this is a process that's really adapted over time. But if you're not aware, a lot of our lakes and our fisheries resources across the state have 5-year management plans. And these plans dictate how, our staff are going to manage these resources over a 5-year span. And to gain support for these and to better inform these management plans, the Fisheries Division established a 2-part facilitated meeting process where basically we have a meeting that's open to the public. Anybody can attend. We select a neutral location, and we have staff that present kind of the status of the fishery. And then we have a facilitated organized time where people can provide their input. And the benefit to this is staff were able to collect data about stakeholder desires that were realistic. And the reason I have realistic kind of highlighted, with the asterisk there is simply because a lot of the time we get fisheries management input where people tell us what we should be doing. And a lot of the time that input is stuff that we as AGFC don't have a lot of control over. Things like water level control on Corps of Engineer owned lakes, spraying for aquatic weeds, on water bodies that have spraying limitations. And the staff doesn't necessarily know all those intricacies, about how that go into managing these resources. And so being able to get in front of them and hear these desires firsthand, we're able to kind of problem solve some of these concerns and say, hey, here's what we can do, but here's some things that are kind of outside our control, and here's why. Staff can also share management intentions and relative fisheries related information. This is, again, going back to what I mentioned before, this is a great way for staff to increase public understanding and transparency, which hopefully in turn translates into public support and compliance to new regulations, and just general support and encouragement for the decisions that our staff have to make. And finally, stakeholders got the opportunity to voice their opinions, concerns, and pose questions directly to staff, which is really, really important because everybody on this call has had an opinion before. They've also probably all been in a position where they've really wanted to share their opinion and probably weren't able to. And when we do that to the public and we say, oh, we value what the public does, but we don't, and we value what the public thinks, but we don't give them an opportunity to actually voice their opinion, there starts to create a distrust. There starts to create well, you don't actually have my best interest. And we can't take the best interest of every individual angler, but for large groups, it's important that we do consider those. And these facilitated meetings were a great way to do that. So in closing, I just want to highlight that conservation social science supports management and conservation decision making. The decisions to conserve or manage a species or their habitat is critical. And again, we're a conservation fish and wildlife agency, so that they come, those really are the quote unquote bread and butter of what our agency does. But conservation social science is here to help support those decisions. And then incorporating social science helps to understand not only the why, but also the why not. And if we're going to make decisions that impact our stakeholders, we have to understand why they're doing what they're doing, but we also have to understand why they're not doing certain things. Why are they fishing on this lake, but not this lake? Why are they visiting this WMA, but not this WMA? And that's where social science comes into play. Conservation social science data helps to ensure that natural resource management and conservation is relevant. Again, this speaks to that whole cultural trend that I spoke to at the beginning. The decisions we make, it's hard to think that maybe what's going on, outside of these walls impacts the decisions we make inside, but the reality is it does. And by using social science and social science data, we can get an understanding of the current status and the cultural influence and how that might impact people's use and value and appreciation for our natural resources. And then that in turn impacts and kind of helps to inform the decisions our staff make. And finally, conservation social science does enhance communication between AGFC and Arkansans. And that's really, really important if we speak back to the mission statement of wanting to, gain public understanding, support, and promote sustainable use. We have to have clear lines of communication, and we do that through conservation social science. And so with that, I am done. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or there's my email. Feel free to email me. If you ever have a question, you have a question of how you should ask the right question, I'm always here to help. And with that, I'm finished.
Thank you, Jessica. Does anybody have any questions to follow up Jessica's presentation? Feel free to unmute and just throw your question out or type it into the comments section if you'd like. Jessica, I was going to ask you, you provided a lot of examples there of different, human dimensions type work that we've done as an agency. Can you, and you touched on this, but I mean, can you provide any examples of maybe where, and you talked about this with turkey, but regulations where, maybe we had one idea of a direction we wanted to go, and then through some of this research, surveys, focus groups, where we maybe went in a different direction based on what we learned. Is there an example of that you can share?
So yeah, I'll touch on I think a really good example is actually the Stream Team Participant Survey. A really good example right now is actually the Bank Angler Survey. That project's kind of ongoing, but I was approached by our Stream team to conduct a user participant survey and to better understand, basically, do people still participate in the Stream Team program? If they do, what are they looking for? How can our team benefit from that? And one very kind of odd outcome that wasn't really anticipated was we kind of found out that the database we have of stream team participants is relatively outdated. And so a lot of the data we got was useful, but it actually, what we decided to do was kind of almost start from scratch, create a whole new game plan for the stream team, or at least they did, start recruiting new stream teams, kind of just say like, that information is beneficial, but we now realize we don't really have as many active participants as we thought we did. So we need to kind of change our game plan as a program. We can work on and start to address these issues that we gained in the survey, but really we need to kind of take a few steps back and start from scratch. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that was kind of an example of where we kind of learned something a little bit unexpected. So
yeah, no, totally. I was just, trying maybe address some examples of like we're this type of work actually, put us on a course that was, more in line with, maybe what the public was wanted, or, where we can work together.
Yeah, and the bank angler survey is a really good example of that. So through the preliminary data that I have right now shows that bank anglers primarily and significantly are fishing for catfish. And we come from this perception that bass is king, and if it's not bass, trout is what drives all of our non-residents. And all of that is still very true, but there's a significant portion of our angling supporters and our angling base that are heavy catfish anglers. And now we're sitting in here thinking about, what is our plan for catfish management? What does that look like moving forward? Do we need to give it more attention? And so that kind of was kind of like wow, a lot of people fish for catfish. And so you start to think about, we need to really connect with our Arkansas River biologist in that program. We need to look at these stockings that we do, these put and take catfish fisheries. How do we promote those more so people know more about family and community fishing locations and things like that. So it's very informative.
Thank you, Jessica. Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. Great presentation. Looks like Sean Lusk is stepping out of the on-deck circle into the batter's box. For those that don't know Sean, he's been with the Game and Fish Commission for about 5.5 years, and all as a fisheries management biologist out of the Hot Springs Regional Office. Sean is originally from Virginia and received his undergraduate in fisheries science from Virginia Tech, and then, like Jessica, received a master's degree at Auburn University in fisheries management. Sean's going to be talking about Florida strain largemouth bass stockings and the effect on population dynamics in Lake Ouachita. Sean, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Trey. Okay, can you guys see my presentation?
Don't have it yet, Sean.
Is it up there yet?
No.
Okay. All right, you guys seeing it now?
Yes.
We got it, Sean.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, so to start off my presentation, I'd like to start off by acknowledging all my coworkers that assisted with this project. Without their assistance, this project simply would not have been possible. So I'd like to give them the acknowledgement that they deserve. Now, to begin this presentation, we need to start off by turning the clocks back to the year 2003 and heading to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Now, back in 2003, there was a lot of turmoil amongst Hot Springs area black bass anglers, and they were primarily concerned with what they believed was mismanagement of Lake Ouachita, which was resulting in what they perceived was poor black bass fishing opportunities. Now, some of these more passionate anglers came together and formed the Lake Ouachita Improvement Committee, which eventually became the Arkansas Black Bass Coalition. Now, one of these anglers actually published an article in Fish and Game Finder magazine that highlighted a lot of this group's concerns about what they believed was mismanagement and this perceived poor black bass fishing. But the majority of this article actually focuses on what was going on in Tennessee. Now, at the time, biologists in Tennessee were stocking Lake Chickamauga, which is a major Corps of Engineers reservoir along the Tennessee River, with Florida strain largemouth bass. Now, a large percentage of those Florida bass that were being stocked in Lake Chickamauga were actually coming from Arkansas. In fact, they were being produced by the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission's Andrew Holsey State Fish Hatchery in Hot Springs. So in this article, the angler questions why the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission would be sending Florida largemouth bass to Tennessee when those Florida bass should be kept here in Arkansas, and they should be stocked just right down the road from the Andrew Holsey State Fish Hatchery in Lake Ouachita. And to answer that angler's question, we have to take a little bit closer look at largemouth bass in Arkansas. So in Arkansas, we actually have two subspecies of largemouth bass. The first is the northern largemouth bass, which is native to Arkansas. It can be found in almost all of our streams and rivers, and it's adapted to the climate in Arkansas. So we can deal with really hot summers and really cold winters and really wet springs and really dry falls. Now, the Florida largemouth bass is non-native. It's actually native to peninsular Florida, and given the right conditions, it has the potential to reach greater sizes than northern largemouth bass. So because so many of our anglers place a high value on catching really large largemouth bass, these Florida strain bass are attractive to not only anglers, but also biologists. Now, it's important to mention that Florida largemouth bass put in areas where they don't have the right environmental conditions have been shown to have a reduced growth rate relative to northern largemouth bass. They have higher mortality. They're not as fecund. So it's extremely important that we only put these Floridas in a place where they have the potential to positively affect the size structure of largemouth bass in that body of water. And that's largely a function of our Arkansas Game and Fish Commission Black Bass program, is to look at all of our bodies statewide and determine where these Florida largemouth bass have the greatest potential to have a positive effect. And because these Floridas are a finite resource, we really have to be cognizant of where these fish are actually going. So fast forward to 2006, after several years of evaluating the lake conditions in Lake Ouachita and taking into account that these Floridas are a finite resource, it was determined that Lake Ouachita did provide suitable habitat for Florida largemouth bass, and an 8-year Florida largemouth bass stocking program was initiated. Now, during each year of this stocking program, 100,000 fingerling Florida largemouth bass were stocked into two isolated areas of Lake Ouachita, Buckville and Rabbit Tail. Now, the reason why all those fingerlings were stocked into these two isolated areas opposed to stocking them around the entire lake is because this is what the biologists in Tennessee were doing with Lake Chickamauga. And at the time, Lake Chickamauga was starting to crank out some really big largemouth bass. And shortly after this, Lake Chickamauga would actually be home to Tennessee's state record largemouth bass. So this philosophy has been shown to work. So there was no point in us rolling in here and reinventing the wheel. So we decided to adapt Tennessee's model to Lake Ouachita. Now, 100,000 fingerlings may sound like a lot of fish. And for those of you that don't know, a fingerling is about a 2-inch fish that are hatchery stocks. That's a pretty standard largemouth bass that they stock around the state. And although 100,000 fingerlings sounds like a lot of fish, that's actually a drop in the bucket compared to what's reproduced naturally just in these two stocking areas. So, let alone lake-wide. So when we stocked these fish, there was no intention on those fish actually starting to move the lake-wide size structure or the amount of genetics that were in the total lake overall. In fact, what we were relying on was stocking these fish, knowing that a percentage of them were going to survive to maturity. And once those fish became mature and started spawning with the more abundant native northern largemouth bass, that's when we expected to see those Florida genetics really start moving throughout the lake. And at that point, we'd start to expect to see 5+ pound fish being caught more regularly and more trophy fish showing up. So our short-term goal for this project was to cause 40% of fish in those two stocking areas to contain Florida genetics by the conclusion of this stocking study. with our long-term goal being increasing the catch rate of 5+ pound fish by the conclusion of the, just long-term was to increase the catch rate of 5+ pound largemouth bass. So before stocking, during stocking, and after stocking, we went into the stocking area and collected several hundred fin clips off largemouth bass and evaluated the genetic composition of those fish. And what that allowed us to do was to track trends in the percent of fish that contained Florida genetics throughout the entire stocking process. And so now fast forward to 2016. By 2016, we had gone into the stocking areas. We had done all of our stocking. We had collected all of our fin clips, and we had processed all those fin clips. And so what we found was actually quite interesting. So this top figure was rabbit tail. The bottom figure is buckbill. And across the horizontal axis, we have our year. And across the vertical axis, we have the percent of our fish with Florida genetics. Now, this red line, this red dashed line, indicates the a priori standard of success. And so what we found was really interesting. Before we ever started stocking, there was already quite a bit of Florida genetics present in both of these areas. And by the midpoint of our study, we had successfully surpassed that 40% a priori standard of success of causing at least 40% of the fish to contain Florida genetics. And by the conclusion of the study in 2016, the overwhelming majority of fish that we sampled contained Florida genetics. Now, it's important to mention that although the majority of these fish contained Florida genetics, they were not Florida largemouth bass. In fact, these fish were largely northern largemouth bass with trace amounts of Florida genetics. And the reason why that happens is because, like I mentioned before, the fish that we stock, our pure Floridas, are a drop in the bucket compared to the number of northern largemouth bass that are in the lake. So because a pure Florida and northern largemouth bass will readily spawn, just by the laws of probability, our pure Floridas were spawning with northern largemouth bass. And so that first generation cross, which we refer to as an F1, is going to be 50% Florida and 50% northern. And so again, by the laws of probability and just random mating, this F1 more than likely is going to spawn with a pure northern largemouth bass. And its offspring is now going to be 25% Florida. So this is going to go on for years and years. And after generations, what we end up with are a ton of fish that are predominantly northern with trace amounts of Florida genetics. And so we have a technical term for these fish, and they're referred to as northern back crosses, or FXNs. So essentially what we did in these two stocking areas is we shifted the genetic composition away from our pure northern largemouth bass towards these FXN fish. And so that begs the question, how does the FXN compare to our native northern largemouth bass? Do these FXNs, because they have trace amounts of Florida, does that mean that they grow larger? Does that mean that they live longer, that they're easier to catch? Or is the opposite true? Do they have lower growth rates? Do they have higher mortality rates? Are they more difficult to catch? And this is a question that doesn't pertain to just Lake Ouachita. This doesn't even pertain to just Arkansas. This is a question that should be being asked across the southeastern United States, because everywhere that we are stocking Florida largemouth bass on top of populations of naturally reproducing northern largemouth bass, we are creating a ton of these FXN fish. So essentially across the southeastern United States, we are shifting the genetic composition away from northern largemouth bass to these FXN fish. And so as a biologist with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, our primary responsibility is being good stewards of our natural resources and making sure that the decisions that we are making now are not having a negative effect on the resources for future generations. So in 2019, over a decade after we had first stocked Lake Ouachita with Florida largemouth bass, we approached our research division and asked if they would help us design a study to evaluate differences in basic population vital rates between our pure northern largemouth bass and these FXN fish. And so the objectives of our study were to evaluate the effects of Florida genetics on growth, mortality, the age at maturity, and angler catch rates. And unfortunately, this angler catch rate component of the study really blew up on us, so we had to completely scrap that part of the study. So we're just focused on growth, mortality, and age at maturity. but we have full intention on coming back and trying to shed a little bit of light on differences in angler catch rates between our pure northern largemouth bass and our FXN fish. So to start looking at this, start looking for differences between FXN and our northern largemouth bass. In 2019, we collected 1,000 largemouth bass from around Lake Ouachita. And on each fish, we got a length, a weight, we pulled otoliths for aging purposes. We evaluated the gender. We removed all the ovaries from the female largemouth bass for a histological evaluation. And we took a fin clip from each fish. And the way we evaluated these fin clips, it gave us an estimate of the percentage of each individual fish's genome that was comprised of Florida largemouth bass genetics. And so what that genetic composition looked like was actually pretty interesting. So this is what the genetic composition of Lake Ouachita looks like. Each one of these X's represents a location where we collected largemouth bass for this study, and the colors correspond to different levels of Florida influence. So the blue color represents pure northern largemouth bass. So in those areas, we didn't detect any Florida genetics. And the varying shades of green, yellow, and orange correspond to higher levels of Florida influence. Now, our two stocking areas, Buckville and Rabbit Tail, which are indicated with these black lines, had the highest level of Florida genetics, as we would expect. Now, interestingly enough, this theory of stocking just these two isolated areas of the lake, but having an effect on the lake-wide genetic composition proved true. So although we just stocked Buckville and Rabbit Tail, we found Florida genetics all over Lake Ouachita. So the main take-home message from this figure right here is those FXN fish are not isolated to just Buckville and Rabbit Tail. We're finding them all over the entire lake. So our first research question was, has Florida bass stocking affected the growth rate of largemouth bass in Lake Ouachita? So basically, are there any differences between our pure northern largemouth bass, which were there originally, and these FXN fish? And there are a number of different ways that you can approach this question. And I'm going to briefly talk about how we approached this question. So what we ended up doing was focusing on specific ages and genders, and we looked at if there was an effect of Florida bass genetics on the length of that certain age and that certain gender. And so on the horizontal axis, we have the percent of Florida largemouth bass genetics, and that ranged from 0 to 100%, with 0 being northern largemouth bass, 100% being a pure Florida largemouth bass. And on the vertical axis, we had the size of the fish, and in this case, we used length. And so what we were looking for were trends, okay? And there's a number of different trends that we could see. As an example, we could see a negative trend. And so what this would indicate is that the Florida largemouth bass genetics are having a negative effect on the overall size of this particular age and gender. Okay, so this would be the worst case scenario right here. This would indicate that these Florida genetics are leading to a reduction in the overall growth potential of the fish in the lake. Now, another trend we could see would be no effect. So this would indicate that it didn't really matter how much Florida genetics you had, your growth was going to be no different than that of a pure northern largemouth bass. And the third trend that we could possibly see was a positive effect. So this would indicate that as you increase the amount of Florida bass genetics, that your overall size also increases. Now, there's another possibility that we could see a combination of these trends. And so this might indicate that there's a break point. So at low levels of Florida genetics, we might not see really any difference, but once we hit a certain point, we could see a positive effect of Florida bass genetics on the overall length at this certain age and gender. So let's actually get into some real data here. So this was for our females age 2. And so what we found was there was a significant analysis here. So at low levels of Florida bass genetics, there was really no effect of those genetics on the overall length of female age 2 fish. But once we hit about 25% of Florida genetics, we actually started to see a positive effect of those genetics on the overall size of those fish. So potentially, if we exceed 25% of Florida genetics, we could be seeing an increase in the overall growth potential of that fish. Now, it's important to mention that just because this fish has more than 25% Florida genetics does not necessarily mean that it's got a greater growth potential over a northern largemouth bass. There's a distinct possibility that that fish did not inherit that large growth gene, okay? So just because you have a lot of Florida genetics does not mean that you have that large size potential. But we wanted to look at more than just females at age 2. So we wanted to look at the rest of the ages of female largemouth bass. And we also did this for our males, but we're just focusing on females for this presentation. And so across the top here, I'm going to have female age 1, 2, and 3. And at the bottom, I'm going to have female age 4, 5, and 6. And so what we found is at 3 of our 6 age classes, we found a significant analysis. And in these analysis, we see the exact same trend, that at low levels of Florida bass genetics, there really isn't much of an effect of those genetics on the overall size and age for those fish. But once we hit a certain point, we start to see positive effects of those Florida genetics on the overall length of those fish at that certain age. And that point range between 15 to 25%. So overall, what does all of this tell us? Well, our data is suggesting that our Florida largemouth bass stocking is not having a negative effect on growth of our largemouth bass, which is a really good thing. We wouldn't want to see any negative trends here. That would be a stop what we're doing, reevaluate it, go a different direction. But what we're seeing now, at low levels, we don't have much of an effect. And then once we get to a certain point, we are having a positive effect. So this is just growth, and there's a lot more to evaluating just a largemouth bass fishery than just growth. We have to look at mortality, we have to look at recruitment, and just what effect these interactions between these non-native Florida largemouth bass have on other species in Lake Ouachita and in our rivers. So in conclusion, we were able to integrate Florida genetics lake-wide by just stocking rabbit tail and buckbill. And we didn't find much of an effect of Florida bass genetics at really low levels. However, we did find evidence that once we increased the amount of Florida genetics past a certain point, we did start to see positive effects of those Florida genetics on the overall size of the fish that we evaluated. And again, it's important to mention that growth is just one component of the largemouth bass population in Lake Ouachita. We also have growth, and we also have recruitment to take into account. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, anybody got questions for Sean?
I must have answered everyone's questions.
Must have been a thorough presentation. It was.
Probably not.
Anybody going once? Going twice? All right. Sean, thank you so much. Jessica, thank you as well. And thank you to everybody for dropping in on a Monday morning to learn about a couple of pretty cool projects, programs, and a couple of great presentations. Thank you all.